Hello, hello. Jag tror ljudet funkar nu. Ja, det funkar. Bra. Jag testar här också.
Men alltså det är ju live nu.
Ja, det är live. Kör.
Varför inte bara göra så här?
Opposition we have Durham. In closing government we have Welsh Open University, and in closing opposition we have Helsinki A. I'd like to give all the finalists a round of applause. Your understanding was the debate, so without further ado, I would like to welcome Prime Minister President the motion that this House opposes politicians affirming narratives that blame the global financial crisis on the greed of those working in the financial sphere.
Karl Marx said the following: that capitalism was the most progressive system that has ever existed. It is a socio-economic system in which unprecedented progress will be experienced. Because of its adaptability, its resilience, it is something that has been so persistent and so powerful that it has changed the world as we know it. He argued clearly that capitalism was better than the feudal system in the past, the slave economy mode of production. But of course, it was not necessary for it to be as it is because it exploits skill within a specific context. Now, within a historical context, within the post-war settlement context, we experienced some of the good aspects of capitalism, that there's been an institutional and class compromise between capital and labor. We argue fundamentally that what this will do if we blame the financial industry is that we are making a direct frontal attack on capitalism, and that will undermine capitalism as we know it and will potentially destroy the socio-economic system as we know it. That we believe is problematic because there's no proper alternative. So while Karl Marx made the correct analysis in the very first place that capitalism is a progressive system that has made unprecedented success, his conclusion that we should change it to communism has not been successful and will not be successful. We are defending a world in which politicians take the blame instead of the financial system. And that is because the market is an adaptive organ that is responsive to the institutions and juridical legal environment in which it is embedded. It's basically very resilient and adaptive, in which has allowed it to be such an effective system. However, as long as it is not properly harnessed, it can lead to the deleterious effect that we've seen throughout history on multiple occasions, the Great Depression and the recent Great Financial Recession. So we believe that capitalism is fundamentally the best system, and we believe that insofar as we want to preserve this system and create this unprecedented success and restore the prospects of this class compromise in the post-Second World War state of affairs, we argue that that is the affair we want to return to, and this will not be returned to if we fundamentally undermine the system and fail to recover the economy, which we're experiencing right now for the 10 years long slump. The rise of the global financial crisis was due to the mishandling of the government. And this is something that has to be fundamentally understood, that when we attribute blame, we can have different narratives about seeing how things happen. Now, it is true that indirectly the financial capitalists were involved in the process of this failure, that those industries and those institutions that collapsed were indirectly creating reverberating effect into the rest of the global circus of capital, and then something happened. But we have to also understand that enterprise that is a market is responsive to the legal environment in which it is embedded. So now let us take a look at the case of why the politicians were responsible for the global financial crisis. We say that in the 1980s and 1990s, when we experienced that there was decline of the Keynesian welfare state and there was a retrenchment of the welfare state and welfare benefits, it was replaced by a lot of financialization, a lot of financial product. So collective consumption and social economy was replaced with financialization. And the state encouraged the financial industry to expand and to delve into new avenues that it was hitherto excluded from. So we see that it's included, first of all, so the American Reinvestment Act were encouraged mortgages and encouraged ordinary Americans to buy mortgages, even though they were not very weren't able to pay these debts off. So the whole idea about subprime mortgage was something that was actually encouraged by the government because they facilitated and encouraged financialization. It was a replacement of the failure of the welfare state because they wanted to have a trade offset the losses of the welfare state to appease the interest of labor. But this solution has essentially caused the current crisis. So first of all, it encouraged excessive investment into mortgages, which then led to the bubble that we subsequently experienced. Second of all, it removed a lot of the constraints that were placed on speculation and speculative processes. And this fundamentally also permitted the industry to act upon whatever environment it was given. Third of all, we also see that it was poorly regulating the newly emerging complex financial instrument market. And that also encouraged them to use exploitative tendencies and engage in excessive patterns of exploitation. Closing.
Is it fine for me to kill a man if I don't get caught?
Depends. We can make two fundamental arguments, given having in mind two fundamental arguments that we will restore the economy as fast as possible. The first argument, what is the danger of wrongly attributing the blame to the financial industry or capitalism more generally? Second of all, why the blame of politicians is only the forward solution, insofar as we want to preserve the capitalist system and create a more better society. So consider the first argument of why it is deeply dangerous to attribute the blame to financial capitalism or to capitalism more generally speaking. So what is financial capitalism or what is the financial industry? Well, we argue that the financial industry is basically the very essence of the hallmark of so-called globalization in the 1980s and onwards. It basically embodies the full idea that there should be a free circulation of labor, that there should be a lot of labor capital, and that allocation of capital will allow to create the most efficient allocation of resources. That in turn will also level the playing field between economies. So economies that are underdeveloped, which have a lot of growth potential, they will be invested to and therefore allow economies to grow much faster. This has allowed a lot of countries to prosper that are formally speaking developing countries or only emerging economies. Now, what happened when we wrongly attribute financial capitalism? Well, there's been two responses and two tendencies and movements within society. There's been right-wing and left-wing populism, and both of them has been very dangerous. From the point of view of the left-wing populists, they try to undermine the capitalist system by trying overthrowing. They want to seize the means of production, they want to undermine capitalism, and they want to undermine fundamental structures of what keeps capitalism together. This is deeply problematic insofar as we want to preserve capitalism as a system because that it has been the most efficient and because of all the horrors that happen under communism is not a peaceful exchange. Insofar as scholars, politicians, and activists have no proper response to how we should organize society differently, no consistent response, we believe at least capitalism for the next 100 years will be the system that we should maintain. So from that point of view, the left-wing populism is only undermining capitalist system. From the point of view of the right-wing populism, it has led to a lot of protectionism and nationalism. Ethnic nationalism has been in part manifested in the idea that we should protect the country, that we should go away from globalization, and then indirectly also curb the power of financial capital. We believe this is problematic because if we look back in history, whenever we have systematically curbed trade and interaction, we see that it's like a bigger than neighbor process. When you actually encroach upon the economies of other countries, you isolate yourself. So this aspect of protectionism and actual direct attack on other countries has led the economy to slow down so it cannot properly recover. So the consequence is essentially that we're only deferring the recovery that's already taken more than 10 years of the global economy to recover, and it will lead to more people dying of starvation, more people being losing their benefits, more people being on food stamps. All these things are harming people. This is the active impact that will only reinforce it's already. Right? So we believe that if we want to recover the economy, this is the way in which we do. The second argument is, and which we'll elaborate upon by my partner, is why blame the politicians is the only way forward. As we argue, the economy is a neutral institutional field that is responsive or is integrated with the broader nexus of extra-economic institutional structures. So the actors within the economic system, they only respond to the incentives that are given. Insofar as they give the wrong incentives under the status quo, we believe that this is why they should be responsible for regulating the economy properly. And that's why we should blame the politicians for all the mishandling of the economy. Blame the game and not the player. That's fundamentally what we will argue. for all these reasons, I beg to propose.
Thank you for having the speech. I would like to welcome the leader of opposition. thank the leader of opposition for that speech. We'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
First of all, I think that we can be clear that at this point, the debate is pretty clear on what we should be voting on, right? The metrics for the debate are, first of all, who should be taking the blame principally, but we think that that's a smaller thing, like who did the thing wrong. We think that most importantly is whose best fit is wrong. That's what opening opposition is also talking about. That's what we're talking about. That's what you should be voting on as a panel, right? What do we hear from opening opposition? Firstly, they say that their metric is that we should be blaming them for the greed that they have, and they want to do a nuanced blame, right? Two problems. Firstly, I think that greed is inherent to the system of capitalism, right? Greed is inherent in the sense where capitalism is built upon people wanting to gain as much profits as they want, and if they don't act rationally, then the system falls apart, right? I think that that's one of the foundations of capitalism. So therefore, they have to oppose in some sense the nature of capitalism. What we give you, on the other hand, is that we say that we want to put the blame on the actors who can then control that greed, because we want to have the greed, because that's how the system works, but we want to regulate it, and therefore we think that the only blame that is necessary and that is effective is on the politicians, because they are the ones who can regulate the outcome of the greed and how that comes out as practical actions, right? No, thank you. Secondly, they talk about how blame is effective because politicians like Elizabeth Warren are really good at making change, right? Firstly, that's very contradictory with their own case, right? They say that politicians aren't really to blame for this because all of the lobbying, the financial sector has such a big influence on the system as a whole. So that's just a little bit contradictory. Secondly, I'll be clashing with it a lot with the argument that I'll be making later, right? That was the extraneous things. No, thank you. What did Alex, like just a few things on what they responded to Alex's case. Firstly, to talk about when it comes to politicians being responsible, we think that one more thing is this is just a principle, like a principal reason for why they should, right? We think that generally the concept of don't hate the player, hate the game is especially important when it comes to the idea of capitalism, because we need to promote greed, but we also need to control greed, because we need to acknowledge that greed also leads to decisions that are bad in many situations, right? Sometimes greed takes over, and that means that people do things that are not helpful. So we need to regulate that greed, right? Secondly, we think what's important is that the politicians have shown time and time and again a willingness to bail out because of the too big to fail kind of like system, right? We think that is problematic because that specifically encourages the kind of toxic, greedy behavior that we want to avoid by regulating, right? Secondly, he talks about distrust in the system, right? A few extra impacts that I thought of, which I think are nice, right? Okay, firstly, we think that the distrust in the system because of how, well, the financial sector failed, we all agree, because we're all putting our blame on the financial sector, we think that those are the ones that are failing. That means that there's a distrust in the system. What does that mean? That means that the population gain an apathetic attitude towards the system. This means that we see movements, such as currently in the United States, a lot of people not voting because they're apathetic towards the system, because the entire system is naturally interconnected, right? Because the politicians are saying the financial sector is wrong. We're not going to really do anything about it. We're just going to throw a lot of money at them and hope that they'll do better next time, right? I think that this causes the anti-establishment movements. Alex talks to you about populism. And lastly, we think that it also just extends to politics because they don't regulate, right? We think that those are clear impacts that are bad when it comes to districts, right? Okay. Thirdly, he also talks about how blaming politicians is effective, right? Talking a little bit more about that. I think that what's crucial is, look, we're not arguing, we don't have to, like, we just oppose things, right? So we don't have to argue that politicians will actually be like, oh, no, don't worry, this is all our bad, right? We don't think that that's probably very likely to happen, but we want to say that that's what they should be doing, right? So what that means is, in a world where that happens, it's very crucial to note that that means that there is a political will to do so. And she's one who has acknowledged that it's the political system that is wrong, right? She has acknowledged that it's the regulation that is needed, and therefore she's actually our role model for how we would like to see things, right? We would just like to see things like this as a general rule in politics, right? And we think that understanding that the underlying premise for capitalism is greed, we think that it's essential to note that politicians are the only ones who can actually change the way that things are going with the greedy corporations that are opening opposition think are so bad. No, thank you. Right. Lastly, they have a quick response where they talk about how lobbying is actually the reason, and therefore we should be blaming them. First of all, we don't really care. We just want to do what's most effective. But also, lobbying is kind of a part of the system. We like maybe there would be willingness to regulate that. I don't really care. All right. More importantly, I have an argument, and that's great. Okay. So the argument is basically is talking about how pushing blame means that nobody takes the blame in the end, right? So just going through the process a little bit, right? Let's say, okay, so in the financial crisis, there's blame to be put somewhere. Something went wrong, so there's blame to be put. What does that mean? That means that the politician, in this scenario, politicians push the blame away. They say that it's the financial sector's fault. There's all these greedy people who didn't run their business properly. They're bad businessmen, right? What that means is the first consequence means that there's no blame on politicians, right? The blame that comes on the politicians are the people who don't believe the politicians. When it's all the mainstream politicians that are saying, no, it's not us, then we think that that's likely to be a large part of the constituency who thinks, or a large part of the population who thinks, okay, well, maybe it's not the politicians. Even the ones who disagree are then a part of our big harm of distrust and blah, 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 right? Secondly, that means that the blame is then put to the financial sector. What's crucial to note about the financial sector is that they are considered necessary, so that means that they're bailed out and they stay there. What does that mean? That means that the accountability that happens at most happens to people who are in management, who you can direct some kind of criminal liability to. I think that rarely happens, but even when that happens, we think that has little to no effect on the system as a whole. Why is that? Because the system is structured in a way where the greed that we have, that we acknowledge as a part of the system, the greed that we acknowledge as a part of the system is encouraged and promoted. What does that mean? That means that when one person is put to jail, but 500 other people in the company receives no repercussions except for maybe a slap on the wrist financially, but they still get a bailout, that means that the system then continues on, right? We think that means that there's little to no effect on that note. We think that if opposition wants to make a PR argument, we think, okay, sure, they get a PR storm for a couple of weeks, but still they're too big to fail. Bank of America won't go away just like that, or Lehman Sachs or whatever. I was just saying company names. Okay. Oh yeah, also that just means that when this happens, right, we think that specifically when it comes to the American context, but just generally in the Western world, we think that there's an attitude that we encourage and we embrace the free market. So that means that there will be people who come out in support of these companies and say, no, they need to be able to do what they want. We think that provides not even just blame not being put anywhere, but that provides resistance against regulations, which is definitely bad. So the comparative in the end is that we want to put full and focused blame on the only ones who can change it. Opposition wants to put nuanced blame, which means that there's no change, no accountability, mostly just a couple of people fired. Proud to propose.
the next few minutes, the speech, so the second half of the debate, the member of government here.
Everyone's ready? Graceful justification, what happened 10 years ago, doesn't really matter. As long as the people who are being harmed as a working class, their life currently couldn't be dressed any better. What we can show you was the mechanism of how this group of people who, by abandoning this and holding this narrative, substantially can getting better, and that is how we can get an improvement under our side of house. Opening up play around of like all this greedy voting thing and saying that this is getting substantially worse, but without really telling the reasons about how like politicians using this narrative can aggregating more power on using their own control and producing more policy in favor of all this working class that are responsible for them, rather than just getting vote itself, which doesn't give them any substantial change. That's how the extension of closing gulf will jump through in this debate. So 3 things to notice from here. So firstly, directly engage with open opposition's material in case of how this change within the politician will happen, which we told it not necessarily happen, particularly look at the context with like the right populism that exists in the United States and Europe. Secondly, I'll talk about how necessarily that the change of these left-wing people are willing to engage with corporation, are more likely to delivering better policy towards the public. And thirdly, how we change the individual buying behavior and how we change their life in a relatively better way. So first, we want to point out with the how does all these like politicians play and why we think they will always like to win. The only mechanism we get from open opposition was somehow people would like to push for their own constituency in order for their politician to really working for it. Opening up and saying that banks are too big to fail. So overall, the comparison, the question that will resolve in the deadlock is which one is more powerful in a way of gaining efficiency in this very first place. We told you that the bank or all these like big corporations are more likely to become more efficient in a way of pushing policy insofar they can gain bypassing all this Congress in like on a time matter, insofar they are more efficient to directly correlate with the politician, given that they have the money power. Overall, insofar that's true, that even if they probably would likely to listen to people, but listen to people for relatively longer periods, which is not efficient anymore. Secondly, you need to look into the context in the current status quo, because the people not only just opposing all this like all want liberal working class to be better off overall. The current context in this particular status quo is not only liberal people's populism exists, but also right-wing populism also exists. You couldn't just simply tell us because people want better policy in order to like disfavor of banks, and then therefore it will be changed. You still need to consider the opposition voices, which is equally strong in the status quo. Therefore, overall, we don't think the change coming from the open opposition is sufficient enough to deal with the problem, particularly when the big structure do exist. How we are likely to change overall? Because the problem of vote itself and aggregating using all this narrative to getting votes was fine, was efficient. The problem of it is it didn't really deliver real consequences, particularly when, if you are a politician who, even if magnificently, magically getting into the office by all these people's vote as well opening government trying to characterize to you, the problem is your lack of cooperation within the policy, within your term for 4 years or 8 years, in order to give you sustained policy to the other people. The reason why is the big financial system are unwilling to cooperate with you because the fundamental basis of you getting into the power is to get against them, particularly when these are people on the basis of you to getting all this financial support in order to, like, for instance, leverage on any sort of constituency that you want in order to get into the next term. This is the reasons why Bernie Sanders even couldn't really bypass his own policy, his own party election, because Hillary Clinton's are more likely to be favored by this big operation. Insofar, she's more likely to get in all this funding in the very first place. So given that was true, when voting itself, even if you're aggregating that kind of votes, doesn't necessarily help you getting a sustainable way of to delivering all these benefits towards the general public. How, by upholding this narrative, can change that? One, we think you don't put people on extreme, because what we see in the status quo was left people have their own populism insofar as saying hating all these people who are like elite section is necessarily a bad thing. But people on the opposition side saying that we do want more, we want more tax break because we earn money and we deserve that money. Nobody really willing to really listen to us, and there's no middle ground in itself in order to getting certain type of change. We change that narrative by giving the corporation certain incentives to working with us to telling them, because we think the change in the disparity currently was not like the right wing have 100% vote in the current status quo. The disparity between one another is relatively small. So as long as we can gain certain kind of cooperation under our size, particularly this corporation don't want tax break to attract new industry to boom up in the status quo, and sometimes some tax incentives give more cooperation to set up that was somehow bad for the big existing corporation in the very first place. We're likely to sway some cooperation under our side of house. These small change over cooperation buying are very likely to be significant under our side house because you gain the sustainable thing that I mentioned before in order to leave the consequences that will be better off. How does this likely? I'm sure. Go ahead.
So what happens is that when you have individuals like Donald Trump becoming successful, that's because of the types of narratives that you are forced to defend because of your opening, that the government is explicitly at fault and the ones that everybody should blame.
Look, I think the people who are on the right-wing sides are something that you couldn't change anyway. What we're changing for is like within Liberal Party and within party who are on the left, how this narrative and what strategy you need to use in order to upholding all this established infrastructure. That is how the closing gap extension are likely to win this particular bit, right? So why we think when we are changing that and giving you a more sustainable way, are we likely to changing the overall behavior of the individual buying? Because currently the narrative exists on the left side, particularly people who are buying this narrative as a working class are skeptical and afraid of investing towards the big money power into investment banking or any sort of things which are likely to benefit the rich. The reasons for that was because they feel like these people are never for us and never standing for them. They're skeptical of buying, skeptical of investing, and holding all this money back in order magically some politicians can really helping them in this particular process. When your leaders, some leaders you are believing for, are telling you that somehow what you originally is wrong, which they likely to believe in the very first place, given that there's only two-party system in the United States, and also people are more likely to stick to their original party with narrative change. I do think that can be successful as an assumption given in this particular way. When the narrative change and you're likely to believe the leader that told you so, that we think your buying behavior are also likely to change, right? Because currently in the status quo, only rich people are willing to get into investment banking. Only rich people are willing to invest in order aggregating more money by themselves, where like the poor people who do have the money are likely to hold back because they're just afraid of elites. We think ultimately tangible impact on the daily life, even if the politician change wouldn't change it massively, can only happen under our side of house when these people are not so skeptical of cooperating with the big banks, are not so skeptical of investing in the very first place. We think this is a good thing for us to not let rich people aggregate more power. We also don't think it happen under our side of house. Ultimately, that nobody can be perfect unless you find a strategic opposing them. Based on that, very proud to propose.
I would like to welcome a member of the
Panel, I agree with the closing government. The right of politicians to run narratives against certain groups in our society is not contingent on those narratives being true. It's contingent upon the results we get by running those narratives. I'm going to argue that regardless of whether it's true or not that the bankers caused this, it is massively beneficial for like equality in income distribution, for actually getting like better financial regulation in future, for that the politicians generally run these narratives. Before that, I'm going to talk about what the alternative to this narrative is, because I think OG is making a big mistake here, and we should probably sort it out why it's not any better than anything else. All rebuttal in the crowd. Look, OG just tells you that like politicians will take the blame. We think that given that the motion is opposed this, they also on their side of the house need to stand for some realistic alternative in which genuinely they would have something ongoing that like or someone would be blamed for it. We think like for multiple reasons, such as for willingness to get re-elected and so forth, it's very unlikely that the politicians would ever get the blame, and you can't really buy it from OG that they do just because they assert so. We think oftentimes the blame would then be on things like the inevitability of the capitalist market to result in this kind of stuff. The inevitable imbalances of capitalism, or the inevitable horrible stuff of financial innovation and so forth. We think, whereby the case of proposition is that we are getting away from capitalism or whatever and destroying capitalist lifestyle that we get from opening government, that we need to stand against it. We think those alternatives in terms of those impacts are at least as bad as whatever we get by blaming the bankers. We're unsure why it's any better. We just don't think opening government in that sense made a case in this debate. Now to the actually big thing in this debate. Why do we think that regardless of even if the politicians are at blame, it is fair for them to still blame the bankers for this? First of all, on regulation, there's actually first of all on principle stuff, then on regulation, and finally on income equality in the society. Look, we concede that there were mistakes made by the regulation. OO tries to give this answer that these mistakes in regulation were made by lobbying and so forth. We don't think this is intellectually satisfactory. We think it is very hard to look for a root cause of who caused that policy, because there are so many different actors influencing things in the society. We think there's a far more inherent reason why we still have the right to shame these individuals for doing it. We think that reason is essentially that even though the bad regulation of the government allowed it then generally to pull off this kind of policy without it being illegal or without them getting punished for it, that doesn't mean that it's not more immoral. We think at the stage when they actively start abusing this for their own benefit, that is already something that even if it's legal, it's already something that we have the right to shame. We think in general, even if I'm not getting caught, or even if the government allows me to kill a man and nobody sees it, and therefore there's no general or there is a failure of the government in doing so, it is not moral for me to do so. We think the basic principle of consequentialist morality is that regardless of whether it's allowed or not, you should not make an active choice that harms others. We think that on a societal level, the net harm towards a society when actively individuals put their own advantage above the general advantage so far is something we generally should shame for. We think this is a general principle that stands in this debate that we bring you in CO, the generally warrants shaming of these bankers by every single individual, including the politicians. But okay, then to more specific stuff, why the politicians should be doing this. Look, we get this idea of better regulation from opening opposition. However, we don't think that they really provide you with any mechanism on why the regulation now suddenly becomes so better. CG points this out wisely, and we're going to work on this. Yes?
Blaming the industry will not bring about polluting changes. Politicians are bought by the industry, so as long as they're not direct risk, they won't change anything. But if we target politicians directly, they won't get re-elected and therefore directly at risk, and they will change.
Okay, I'm unsure why you just saying you target the politicians directly, you mean you do so. You oppose them blaming the bankers. I'm unsure why that results them in blaming themselves, just not very clear. But specifically on what we get because we blame the bankers. We think at the stage when you as a politician are actively putting blame on the bankers and on the banking system, this generates a huge brand image issue for the financial system and the operators therein. We think it means that they have a huge public perception issue, which means anti-financial instrument policies will get a lot of popularity in elections and so forth. We think that the operational abilities are limited by law oftentimes. We think this generates a unique and huge pressure internally within the financial system to A, be more open about the kind of mistakes they're making, and B, be open also towards the direction of politicians and negotiate with them. CG says that by pressuring, we're not going to get them to negotiate with anyone. We would just like to know that in a current world where financial institutions are hugely strong, have huge leverage and so forth, without us threatening them with this public manner where we actually get the entirety of the public mob behind this idea of bankers are bad and greedy, it is very, very difficult for us to negotiate with them in any circumstance because they already have leverage on governments because of funding politicians, funding even governments and so on. Sit down, no thank you. So we think especially the fact that the people, or that we get a public pressure on them about a negative public perception on them, forces them essentially to solve this public image and brand issue by going open about the problems they have internally, trying actively not to look as bad. And even if they might be able to pull off some sort of trick where they just don't look as bad and are not as bad, in general, we think oftentimes these two things do go in hand, and they oftentimes are forced to actually change their behavior because of this in order to buy back the trust of the public, in order to be able to continue with their work. We think it's in their incentives to do so, and we think that is a great way of actually getting the changes OO talks about. Finally, on why do we think that politicians still have the right to do this, regardless of all the previous things? Look, the motion says oppose politicians doing this. So we don't need to defend them necessarily doing this all the time. We just say they need to have the right to this. We think that the politicians usually have the primary responsibility towards the voters who have put a specific trust in them to forward the interest of themselves in elections. We think it means that they are specifically indebted to their own voters. This means that oftentimes, especially in leftist parties and so on, the politicians are just fine to throw all the bankers under the bus because they literally have a special duty towards those leftist poor people who voted for them. Why do we think this is important? We think this is specifically important because even though every single person knows there's a lot of societal injustice in this world and there are a lot of income differences and so on, it is very hard to point out circumstances where the rich would actively cause harm on the poor. We think it's very hard to advocate for leftist policy often because there is no causal relation or like no clear and easily advocatable causal relation between income inequality and actual general issues to the poor people. At the stage when masses were fucked over by the mortgage market and so forth, and we're able to genuinely, at least on a rhetorical level, point out the bankers are at fault. We get a hugely powerful, unique rhetorical tool that we can utilize in actually fighting income inequality in many other places. The causality here, regardless of whether really it exists or not, is so easy for anyone to point out. It's so uniquely easy for even a voter to understand that we get hugely more leverage for income equality on our side of the house. Look, we changed the world. At best, the opening houses changed the regulation. So glad to stand in CEO today.
The member of opposition for speech, including the government bench, the government.
Closing opposition said they don't want to talk about who's really at fault, and they still spend 4 minutes talking about why it is justified to blame them because it's wrong of the bankers. We completely agree. We told you the metric for you to judge this debate is how this narrative plays a role in the decision-making process, how actually you make the changes that all they want, which you agree upon, to become possible. And my partner have told you how actually you alienate them, you push them to the other side, you push them to all those right-wing populism, and we'll later to tell you why is that. A few extraneous rebuttals. Firstly, also apart from all their irrelevant financial analysis, also talk about we can also use the narrative to teach people how this happened and to educate them. We tell you that is simply not true because in most cases, politicians when they're using narrative, they're using, as they said, overly simplistic because, as I said, it's a very complicated issue. So for them to be appealing, it's more likely what like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn is doing. Okay, 1%, we are all wrong, down. But we think that is completely ineffective at all. And also, closing opposition talk about how politicians have the right to do so because they can always use that as a way to appeal to the voters. But we don't think that is really relevant to this debate. Even if you do have the right to do so, and we think the basis of the debate is that how do you make all the change we want happen? So let's talk about that. Firstly, we said we agree with all the regulations needs to happen, but we tell you that their narrative is either ineffective because my partner told you there are a lot of other opposition like right-wing narratives also existing, so it's either ineffective or what it really needs to be effective. Then it has to be overwhelming, simplistic, and because then that is the only way that you can actually persuade people into that, because that's what the right wings are doing. So insofar as that's true, we tell you that is highly counterproductive and pushes a lot of backlashes. Firstly, within the left-wing parties themselves, within the Labour Party or the Democratic Party, as the partner have told you, actually you could write the kind of political correctness. If you're now in the Democratic Party, if you know with Bernie Sanders, you are a traitor, you are a sellout. So that will actually push those Labour parties to the extreme left with this narrative. This is too simple a way to get the vote. So that is why we think within these parties you don't really have a clause of a rule to reach to a sensible policy, because even if you say Bernie Sanders is getting a lot of support within the Democratic Party, but you're never going to get the support you want in the House, in the Congress, and and that leads to the second layer. Why actually you also alienate and radicalize actually those big companies and big corporations or bankers that you want to break up, that you want to deal with. We tell you actually, for a lot of bankers, they actually do not really all buy into the narrative of those right-wing populists, but you are pushing them to cooperate with it. A lot of those bankers actually
they actually do have their own concerns over Trump's policies. But when you are demonizing them, saying, oh, it's all their fault, they are monsters, there's no way other than actually cooperating with the right wing to push for all the more protection for the banking industry. So therefore, we tell you that and also providing one partner told you that they are so powerful in the very first place. It's much more likely for them actually to influence the policy. So the CEO about just shame them, and then how miraculously then people are going to push for the policy. That's simply truth and this. That's simply not how changes happen. But before they are willing to take closing.
The entire idea of the populist right will now be the place where the bankers go is just bollocks. The populist right advocates for protectionism and conservative financial policy, which is not very good for people who need a liberal environment to actually make the money.
So that is exactly what I talk about. These bankers, they do have concerns over these right-wing policies in some issues. They don't want all the protectionists because it drives up their labor costs. But in the fundamental issue of their own identity, when you are demonizing them as all the monsters, that is when they have no choice in this calculation. They are willing to sacrifice certain of their costs of the protectionist of the harm that protectionism may bring them, but they are willing to go with them and to refute all the changes you want to pursue. So now let's talk about how we think without this narrative, you are more likely to promote all the regulations you want. We tell you that actually in the very first place, these big bankers, they do have the incentive to push for more regulations. If you're not really you push them to the radicalism in the very first place. Because when you have especially all the big Wall Street bankers that they blame the financial crisis on, they do have an incentive to use this regulation actually to push out small companies and to push them out of the market to strengthen their control over the whole financial market. So therefore, we tell you this is a very important incentive that the left actually can utilize to put them into the negotiation table and to actually to produce sensible reforms that is happening. So therefore, we tell you when you are having this narrative, you are shutting down this dialogue in the very first place. Yes.
People who are already mad at banks can either support parties who want to regulate greedy bankers or anti-establishment candidates who are probably bad. If they see this lack of blame as governments being complicit with those bankers, which of those options is more likely?
People do not vote simply on this very narrative. So we don't think this whole analysis on the influence on voters is that much important. More important, the most important impact of this narrative should be on the impact of those bankers, whether you are able to make them to be willing to compromise and to produce all the policies you want. So therefore, continuing. And when you have this narrative, you are not going to make them to cooperate with you. But when you no longer have this narrative, provided that all the contents they told you, then there's all this right-wing populism existing on the right. So we think under this polarization of our politics, when actually the left is willing to shift a little bit to the center, that would be a very important things that they can capitalize to not only attract voters that they want, but more importantly to be willing to appeal to those bankers, because we told you that they actually otherwise they are powerful, they are strong. We have to accept that. Therefore, the only way for us to achieve this change is not by the Marxist way of blaming them for all faults. That's not going to be effective because I come from a country where Marxism kills 3 million people. But more importantly, you have to achieve again all the compromise that happened in the 1950s and 60s between the capitalists and the labor, which enable all the welfare system we have now. So this is the time for another compromise like that, and we think this the opposition to this narrative is going to achieve that. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Government, for that speech and for the speech of opposition bench and in the debate of the opposition.
Already?
Let's be honest with ourselves. Politicians lie. The role of politicians in our society is not to tell people the factual truth about economics and educate them about that. At the very best, if we believe like politicians have the best possible role they can in society, that is to craft political visions and policy plans in the hope of bettering society. Political rhetoric is a tool to get voters behind that vision and policy plan you have, and has to appeal to intuitions and narratives that people already buy into to resonate with them. You simply do not, as a politician, have infinite time for people's attention to convince them of an entirely factual worldview in all cases. That is broadly why opening like half falls out of this debate. I'm going to summarize this debate on 2 points. Firstly, I'll talk about why this specifically enables political capital to address income inequality and like is better informed political solutions. Secondly, I'll talk about societal effects of this rhetoric and why you get more accountable financial institutions. So to start with politics, right? I first want to address the alternative that we got from opening government, because opening opposition wasn't entirely responsive to the OG alternative when they said that you need to have certain kind of political capital for reform, given opening government's alternative was politicians take the blame, in case of which there is no need to increase capital if they would take the blame, right? Like, Jonas' extension already explained why it's quite difficult for politicians to take the blame, but I'll rebut this point, just in noting in terms of what would it actually look like, even if the best case scenario, politicians taking blame would occur, right? Like, not that they would not take the blame to the same degree that they currently give it to the bankers. They would minimize the need for reform, because the more they would say they need reform as a consequence of themselves having failed, the more they would be admitting to a large oversight and a large blame. Note that voters were immensely hurt by this crisis. Many of them lost their homes, lost their jobs, and so on, right? Admitting large blame would consequently be political suicide. They would never ever do that. And consequently, like at the point where they are blame greedy bankers, whether or not that's factual, they are able to propose larger reforms because you have a good justification where you are not blaming yourself. It's quite easy for any political party, like across the spectrum, to say, oh, greedy bankers, we need to contain them. That is why we need to have these policies. So we have the best possibility for political reform compared to God on our side, uniquely provided to you by closing opposition. Furthermore, not in terms of just comparing the approach, that O's explanation is contingent on the assumption that politicians should speak the truth, and that them speaking the truth in terms of who actually caused this crisis is in some way meaningful or important. Now that they are not financial experts, even if they would be right, they would probably make various kind of factual mistakes. The truth is quite nuanced and hard to convey. Jonas' extension explained to you why even if it is not truth, it is still best that they blame the bankers. Why is that? Because we have a huge issue unrelated to the financial crisis in itself, which is inequality. And 10 years after the financial crisis, we massively need political capital to address this issue. Know that income inequality is something that is not always intuitively to people a harm. It is not clear why it is bad that our society has income inequality if you assume that rich people are rich because they have done harder work or done other meritocratic things. Could all please be respectful, be quiet, to achieve that, right? Often they themselves, if you address them about inequality, or ask this question. They ask, why does me having money hurt you, right? That is the reason why a lot of middle class people in particular, it's really hard to get them behind addressing income inequality because it's not apparent to them why them having money is to blame for various issues in society, right? Banker risk is a unique and easy case that resonates for people for why some people being wealthy and trying to gain profit and trying to succeed in the market
market is not something that is meritocratic and makes it fair that they achieve greater things in life, but rather is something that can actually cause like tangible harm to other people. That is why, for example, like Bernie Sanders it has even become relevant, right? Using it like this is something that like people can use to get political capital to address income inequality. We think that is massively important, especially because this is something that can reach different classes, because although middle class people as well were hurt by the banking crisis and can like see that in these cases it has been massively harmful. And that is why you should close, right? I'll take closing at this point.
Growing up to us, we need to know the story, true story that people to regulate themselves. You blatantly knife them in your opening line. How can you justify that?
The thing is, we're not saying that the politicians should lie. We're saying they often do lie, and it's not unclear. So this is the case, even if you do not believe as a panel that there is some kind of obligation of politicians to speak the truth, why, even if in that case you should consider this motion, right? So we're putting this on a different level. We're not saying anything against OO. We agree fully with them, of course. We just are putting this on a second level, which we think is far more fundamental focus, right? Secondly, societal effects of this rhetoric, right? Note, when closing government says that the policy will fail because the rhetoric antagonizes financial institutions. Note that the narrative exists in wider society in any case. Johan already explained to you there's huge pressure on these financial institutions to clean up their public image. Consequently, especially if they were to cooperate with left-wing governments on banking reform, that is something that will massively make them look better. That is the kind of thing that makes people who anyway believe this, whether or not politicians say, think, oh, that seems to be getting better. Maybe I can trust them. Maybe they can be responsible actors, which is really good for banks, so they have the incentive to do this. Secondly, not that governments have power to regulate banks whether or not they want to. Either they are regulated without cooperating with the government, or they are regulated cooperating with the government in case in which they can have some kind of influence. Furthermore, so that Johan's extension explained to you why the industry is more likely to be accountable. Like it is morally reprehensible to exploit loopholes, and at this point, you're more likely to question speculative investments within your institution. You're more likely to have whistleblowers talking about potentially harmful practices, and that is how exactly we'll prevent this from happening again.